My name is John Pfeffer, and I work for the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington, D.C., where I head up a project called Global Just Transition, and I'll put a link to that project in the chat. And as part of that project, we set up a rare earth elements group based on the interests and the expertise of a number of folks in the Global Just Transition universe. And as part of that project, we've done quite a number of things, including, of course, holding seminars like this, but also looking at sites of resistance in various communities around the world, publishing some articles about those places, such as Madagascar and Malaysia, Sweden, and Chile, as well as here in the United States as well, participating with a number of different organizations to put together a mapping of that. But kind of the bread and butter so far has been relying on people in our network to provide expertise and on the research that they're doing. And I'm really so delighted to have with us today really the person who kind of got us started on this venture, and her coworker, and that's Julie Klinger. Julie is an associate professor of geography and spatial sciences at the University of Delaware, and she has published really an essential book on rare earth elements, rare earth frontiers from terrestrial subsoils to lunar landscapes. And that's from Cornell University Press in 2018. I would really encourage everybody to take a look at that because it's kind of the field manual, if you will, to this subject. Coryn Wolk is a Ph.D. researcher at the University of Delaware who has specialized in tracking mineral supply chains and their industrial nodes. And today they're going to talk about, of course, rare earth elements, but military applications, a very important and timely topic. And they're going to actually share one PowerPoint, which is a lovely example of cooperation. And we're going to see how they do that. I'm going to pass this over to them. And then we're going to take some questions afterwards. You can put those questions in the Q&A, and I'll go and see why the chat is not allowing y'all to participate that way. But I'm going to pass this over to Julie and Coryn. Thank you guys so much for coming today.
Thank you so much, John, and thanks everyone for making time in December to come together and think about this. I'm really grateful for this community and the work that everyone does here in their respective areas. As John said, I'm Julie Klinger, professor at the University of Delaware, and collaborating with me today is Coryn Wolk, wonderful PhD researcher and a member of our broader team that is looking at competing uses for rare earths and other designated energy critical minerals and materials. So Coryn, if you could go ahead and share the screen.
I think I am.
You are? Okay, excellent. Okay. So we're going to focus today on the military uses of energy critical minerals. And what we're doing is bringing you into our own unfolding research process where we've branched out beyond rare earth elements to look at a host of other materials, but specifically looking at competing uses among climate hostile sectors, honestly, which includes weapons and military applications. If you could go to the next slide, please. All
right. The definitions.
Yes, please. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm on that.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right. There we are. And so I think this crowd is quite familiar with critical minerals and materials. There's a number of graphs like these floating around that try to plot them in terms of their supply risk or their importance to different applications. And you'll see here that up in the red quadrant, dysprosium, neodymium, praseodymium, terbium are some of the rare earth elements that are indicated as sort of having high criticality, but they also have a lot of company in this quadrant as well. And the other thing that we'd like to emphasize is that just because something is not sort of coded with this designation of criticality doesn't mean that it isn't essential to a host of renewable energy and other important applications, right, such as manganese or aluminum or other elements. Next slide, please. And so to give you a little bit of a sense of context, why are we looking at the military and why the US in particular? There are a number of reasons for this, but one of the things that we found is that typically in reports that are looking at material projections or capacity projections for renewable energy development tend to omit competing uses that are presented by the military. So an example is this NREL report that is on materials used in US wind energy technologies, looking at quantities and availability for 2 future scenarios. They never mention military or defense as competing for wind turbine materials. Next slide, please. And so this is particularly problematic if we consider the competing resource allocations for investments in renewable energy versus the military. And I want to be clear here that in drawing this distinction or this contrast between renewable energy applications and military applications for these materials is not at all to sort of normalize the very problematic aspects of a kind of large-scale business as usual type energy transition. Those critiques are still very much present with us. But returning to this, to quote SIPRI, a SIPRI report that was published this year, they said that they noted that total global military expenditure reached 2,443 billion in 2023. So it's an increase of 6.8% in real terms from 2022, and this is the steepest year-on-year increase since 2009. The 10 largest spenders in 2023, led by the United States, China, and Russia, all increased their military spending. And an important part of this picture is that the US is a major military equipment exporter. And so this difference in the allocation of materials, there's so many different comparisons that we could make in terms of the difference in allocations of money for different priorities. But just one comparison here is the US DoD budget request for fiscal year 2025, inching ever closer to $1 trillion as compared to NOAA, which is the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Their budget requests of $6.6 billion, and they, of course, do research that is critical to climate-related matters. Next slide, please. And this set of slides here gives you a sense of just the differences in the use intensity between civilian and military applications for energy critical materials in general. In this case, we're talking about lithium batteries. So there is a very important and very critical story to be told about the fact that, electrifying the US transportation fleet or the US school bus fleet would require a lot of materials, right? So for example, here, this electric school bus with a 300-mile range would require a 4,800-pound battery. And that, of course, has important implications for global resource supply chains, for environmental justice, labor justice at every step along that supply chain. However, we also think that it is important to view these potential civilian applications in context of competing uses for potential military applications. And so just a simple comparison here is that an electric tank with a 300-mile range would require a 60,000-pound battery, just to give you a sense here. All right, next slide, please. And so one of the reasons why we are presenting to regroup this research that considers other materials besides rare earth elements is because the broader critical materials policy that includes materials besides rare earth elements does also directly bear on the concerns that are front and center for this particular group. So to share some quotes here from a 2018 Department of Defense report, they list aluminum and steel for use in ground vehicles and Navy ships, titanium and beryllium for military aircraft, tungsten for radars and communication systems, rare earths for guided munitions and computers, and ceramics for body armor and microelectrics. They also highlight copper as one of the most important elements a different report highlights copper as one of the most important elements for the country's move toward clean energy. And so there is a growing sense, a growing body of critical work that is looking at the way in which greening the military and efforts to green the military are capturing and co-opting the energy transition discourse, but also with that has come a securitization of energy that is directly linked to ECMs. Next slide, please. And just to give you a sense of the way in which ECMs, or energy critical materials, are also critical to military equipment, this, of course, lists some additional uses. So lithium is used for munition thermal batteries, nickel and cobalt for superalloys and jet turbines. Graphite is used for batteries, motor cases, launch tubes, and carbon fiber. Tantalum for shaped charges, shrapnel, and capacitors. Aluminum is used in explosives. And as we'll talk about a little bit later, aluminum is also quite important for building renewable energy technology. Copper is used in bullet cases, wirings, and shaped charges, and tungsten also in alloys and munitions. Next slide, please. And so that's kind of the broader ecosystem in which rare earth elements are situated. And this image here focuses on rare earths, or the lanthanide series, to give you a sense of the diverse uses. Again, I think this crowd is quite familiar with this. But moving forward, I'm going to hand the floor over to Coryn, and we'll talk specifically about magnets. Coryn, take it away.
Hi, everyone. And so to try not to do too many statistics, but I have a lot, some of which don't necessarily match because so much of this information is kind of classified or unknown, as I'll talk about later. But essentially, the magnets are one of the key uses of rare earths, or lanthanides, and other similar elements that the military is concerned about. And they're used similarly to in EVs. They're used for motors for like power generation, actually moving equipment around, but also a major use that I'll talk about is for control actuation systems. So for guidance in missiles, and also just for seekers in missiles and other things. And as well as scandium, which I forget if it's on this graphic, is used as an aluminum alloy to strengthen it and lighten it. And a statistic that is difficult to get clear answers on, but this is close to a kind of firm number from it. The Defense Logistics Agency in 2023, they proposed acquiring 100 metric tons of rare earth magnet block, 600 tons of neodymium, and 70 tons of praseodymium, potential conversions of 12 tons of rare earth elements, and potential recovery from government sources of 10 tons of rare earths. And the government has also funded projects to try to recover more rare earths from magnets from their own waste, from other sources, above ground uses, et cetera. So because they need so much, they're looking into non-mining sources as well. But of course, from mines is their main source. And sorry, I'm juggling some mouse things. And so a key thing to understand is that the military does use a lot of rare earth magnets, or permanent magnets as they tend to call them, but their share relative to US civil demand or global demand is very small, but also tends to be redacted. And so because of that, there's been more and more integration of trying to promote like demand in other sources and reasons for industry to build out mining and refining and manufacturing capacity in the US and allied countries, so that if you have this kind of larger market and supply, then the military can sort of piggyback off of that. But connected to that, still the military to them is the priority, so that if there was a shortfall because civilian demand is so much and the military is so important, the cuts would come from civilian demand first. And so even though it's usually redacted in one footnote of a heavily redacted report, Novion, who's one of the few US manufacturers, estimated that for neodymium magnets, and so that's just for those magnets of those elements, the military share of demand in the US is 2 to 10%, and those are about 30% rare earths by weight, and 75% right now come from China. But the ones coming from other countries are likely mostly originating from China, just kind of as a pass-through, which is something that's becoming more important in terms of policy. And then samarium magnets are, they're kind of, in some cases they're used interchangeably, but for samarium, they have higher temperature resistance and resistance to demagnetization. So sometimes they're preferred, but sometimes it's about equal, or there's ways of manufacturing neodymium magnets that make them more temperature resistant. And then they also both have other rare earths kind of mixed in there in varying amounts. And some more specific uses, for example, our samarium magnets are used in stealth technology in helicopters to create white noise to cancel or hide the sound of rotor blades. And this is something that I imagine will become more important as we seem to be switching to drone warfare, and which needs a lot of that stealth for closer uses. And then they're also used in disk drive motors in aircraft and tanks, satellite communications, and radar and sonar systems. And one thing that I found in my research is that the new M1A2 Abrams tanks have a rare earth magnet-driven auxiliary power unit, or APU, instead of just a fossil fuel-driven one, because it's it's more efficient, and also it has a lower heat signature, so it's kind of stealthier. And it's also being used in for the MLRS battery system, and the M109 Paladin uses an APU also with permanent magnets for the turret. And the military is also concerned that they need large amounts for Columbia-class submarines, and the F-35, as I mentioned earlier, is also brought up very frequently. And for comparison, for EVs, about up to 95% of them use permanent magnets for their traction drive motors. And usually they use 1 to 2 kilograms of neodymium magnets in kind of your average EV. And then conventional vehicles will use smaller amounts, which is 4 to 356 grams. So not very much, because you also need them for things like the speakers, sometimes the door locks, etc. And and so getting away from rare earths, other kind of critical mineral uses for the military, a big one that we've been focusing on is lithium batteries. And obviously for things like tanks or ground vehicles, they're trying to switch slowly to kind of EV technology. So a rechargeable lithium battery in the way that you would use them in civilian technologies, or for kind of smaller equipment, various rechargeable things. But a big use that is not used in civilian use most of the time, as far as I know, is thermal lithium batteries. So to provide for those guidance functions that they use magnets for in guided missiles, and other things, like to kind of provide propulsion, they use single-use lithium thermal batteries, so not lithium ion, but other chemistries. And this is a major use, and one that they're very concerned about, and that has prompted some policy, but doesn't tend to be noticed or quantified because it's not lithium ion, and it's not something most people think about. And as mentioned earlier, because of this sort of mixture, kind of imbalances of priority and demand, the federal policy on these really mixes up military and energy and normal uses, especially because the military does need these for kind of more normal energy uses. And so there's been a series of executive orders about examining the military supply chains to figure out kind of where the gaps are and what they could do better. And because they don't know a lot of this, and then figuring out strategies for onshoring a lot of this. And so even in their own policy, when they talk about EV batteries, often it's not clear are they talking about EV batteries for military vehicles or EV batteries kind of nationally for their energy transition plans, or at least the current administration's energy transition plans. And so as mentioned earlier, if there was a major shortage, the civilian uses would have bear the brunt of the disruption, as they say. And here's one example use, which is for medical imaging. And Julia, do you want to take over here?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about this. And so there's a really bizarre, as folks working in like the US policy space have been well aware of for some time, there's such a bizarre relationship with respect to the US and China, right? Because on one hand, these are, I think in the history of the world's most interconnected economies. Yet this anti-China narrative and also sort of intensifying rhetoric around the threat of China disrupting the supply of these materials to the US has been a fairly constant, it's been a constant, I guess I would say, for the last 15 years. But that kind of dual relationship manifests in a real dilemma for the defense sector in the US. And so with the first quote here from the US Army Science Board, they say the studies team effort also reflects the assumption that if China continues along an aggressive path in the Western Pacific, the US may face some level of conflict by 2027, right? And with the incoming administration, there's now a kind of sense that conflict with China is inevitable, that it'll happen in the next 2 years or something like this. And so this report from 2023 goes on to say, in that case, the Army will need to be ready by 2025, necessitating program planning now. Yet there is this kind of free market dilemma, right? Where from the US Department of Defense 2023 National Defense Industrial Strategy, they write, over the last decade, the DoD has struggled to curtail adversarial sourcing and burnish the integrity of defense supply chains. Predictably, this approach has delivered only marginal results, with DoD continuing to procure items from adversarial sources, they're referring to China here, in line with low-cost free market principles, but not in line with national security and resilience-oriented principles. Next slide, please. And so what, for many years, concern in DC and in the defense realm with, what happens if China cuts off supplies, which I've been quite critical of for many years, and have noted that, business interests on both sides really stand to lose from such a hypothetical drastic action. Very recently, I think in the last week or so, China announced a ban on exports of gallium, germanium, and antimony. These are super hard metals to the US. Of course, there have been all sorts of crazy headlines that have been trying to call these rare earth elements or rare minerals or what have you. And so note the redaction there in the headline itself, right? But part of that, I think, is also, it might be a sort of very real mistake or lack of knowledge on the part of the editors, but the other part of it too might be a kind of opportunistic reconnection with the supply chain fears and scandals that happened about 15 years ago. And so China now has new restrictions on graphite exports because they do have dual use, both military and civilian uses. And one of the things that they've said that they are considering is banning transshipment to the US. So that means, for example, going back to the slide on magnets that Coryn talked us through, that 9% comes from Japan, other sources from the Philippines and elsewhere. A lot of those things do originate in one form or another or pass through China. And so the question here then is, this is setting us up for maybe a real test in terms of global supply chain and trade surveillance and enforcement. But this also follows on measures to restrict gallium, germanium, and some graphite last year, as well as to restricting antimony in August. And so there's a couple of different ways to interpret this. I mean, there is the very real kind of near and intermediate term concerns about what this might mean for downstream entities in the US. But I think in light of the standpoint that military needs will be prioritized over civilian ones, this is particularly concerning. And this, of course, but on the other hand, this is, in a way, it's good news for industry hopefuls in the US context and among US allied states, because this is unlocking new forms of government largesse to invest in extractive industries and parts of the supply chain. And Coryn will talk about that now.
So this could be its own presentation, and has been sort of a side topic I've been following for a couple of weeks. But the Biden administration particularly, though not exclusively, has been expanding the use of the Defense Production Act, particularly under Title III and Section 303, to expand what countries count as like domestic providers under the Defense Production Act, and direct much more funding for mining and processing of minerals that are useful for the military in the US and allied countries, I guess, as you would say. And so Canada has been a domestic source for a while, and then just this year, the UK and Australia were added as domestic sources as part of kind of global military alliances that they're working on. And already we import a lot from Australia, but it's particularly kind of funny to think of them as a domestic source, given how extremely far Australia is. And a lot of these in the news, and sometimes by the companies or by the government, have been billed as like mines or processing or battery manufacturers just for things like EVs. But in reality, there's a lot of mixture of the kind of overall goal for them and the funding for them and contracts. But a lot of that is either not public because it's not required to be, or just really not being covered that way. And the Inflation Reduction Act, which is kind of viewed as a huge funding source and initiative for renewable energy and energy efficiency and kind of making domestic manufacturing for those purposes, actually included $250 million just for the DoD to spend through the Defense Production Act. And it included the same amount for the DOE to spend through the Defense Production Act. And so this isn't just like the DoD is going to help renewables in general. Like there's a separate pot there for the DOE for kind of mostly more actual civilian uses, but not necessarily. And sometimes they both are spending on the same project. And then there's other sources of money for this as well through both of them. So it's through like major spending bills. So it's really complicated to kind of track how much of the funding is coming from who and for what. And so under Title III of the Defense Production Act, usually at $50 million, there needs to be congressional approval for this funding. But if you use a waiver, then you can spend much more with much less oversight. And so Biden has instituted several of these for ECMs, including for high capacity batteries and also for rare earth magnets, as discussed earlier. And so these include Thacker Pass, which is the huge lithium project in Nevada that's encountered a lot of opposition and which is now mostly owned by General Motors. The Kings Mountain lithium mine in North Carolina that hasn't opened yet and also has encountered a lot of local opposition, and the Lomoco graphite mine in Quebec, which also has not opened yet. And this one was particularly kind of interesting and important because this mine had been billed to locals who are very much opposed to it as being necessary for the energy transition, especially for building like a kind of North American renewable energy industry. And they still were not in favor of it, but it was sort of used as emotional blackmail. And then they found out that the US Department of Defense was partly funding this, and some of the graphite was planned for military use. And this is especially Quebec, not even just like Ontario or something, who have their own kind of tense relationship with the Canadian government, in addition to the US, as sort of a background. And so it'll be interesting to see how this changes with kind of the new stance being taken towards Canada and the new administration. And so as I've been mentioning, the military amount of use and exact uses, besides knowing kind of some munitions or general purposes, is really difficult to know, because this information, when it exists, is heavily redacted to the point of total absurdity. So this is just one chart from one report where pretty much everything except for "we don't know" is redacted. And this and similar reports, everything, like there are pages where every single thing is redacted. So you'll just have like a chart of sort of numbers and everything on it. You can see what the frame of the chart is, but no content at all. But this partly comes from the DoD and industry not actually knowing their supply chains. And some of this has come from defense primes consolidating, and just no one really tracking this. There hasn't been much incentive to, and it's very difficult to do. And this was one of the parts of the executive orders and the major initiatives going on, but they've been talking about this for over 10 years. And there's multiple reports now that just conclude essentially that they don't know what their supply chains are. And as they note, the supply chain could be used as a weapon, which seems to be sort of what they're framing it as, and what is somewhat happening now in this weird dynamic with China. And their analysis tends to focus on the first few tiers of the supply chain, as do several allied countries, though they note that, for example, Germany has way more people in their government who their job is to kind of untangle their supply chains than the US. And a major part of this is the consolidation of defense supply chain contractors. So now, so for the average aerospace company has 200 first tier suppliers. And then when you get to the second and third tier, that's 12,000 companies, which can't really imagine mapping. And then since the 1990s, the defense industry has consolidated from 51 to 5 prime suppliers. And that also reduces their flexibility. And some of this, of course, is, as mentioned earlier, the kind of counter drives towards like free market globalization, whatever is cheapest, consolidate as a corporation and offshore, and the needs of the US military. And for conflict minerals specifically, which of course is a political term, and the regulations for them actually knowing this are very weak. But even if they tried, many of them have trouble knowing this. So which country their things like tantalum or tin or gold are coming from, or tungsten. The ones that have done sort of started an effort in knowing where their companies are getting it from, they assume some of it's coming from countries it's not supposed to, but most of it is either no response from their suppliers or saying that they didn't get it from anywhere bad, but they don't need to show proof. And so as a case study of some of the complexity of this and the uses in military, this will somewhat focus on aluminum, but my colleague Cornell Rousseau and I have worked on a study of Mk84s and JDAMs, which are the guidance units that are added to Mk84s and other kind of dumb bombs, and comparing those to wind turbines. And this is partly because of their extensive use in Gaza by the Israeli military, to the point that the US government temporarily stopped shipments of 2,000-pound bombs and only allowed smaller guided bombs. And magnet control actuation systems in the tail to control where the fins guide the munition. And so JDAMs are not the only use of this, but they are one that's very prominent in the media. And Roma made a series of diagrams showing the overlap in metals uses and components made of those same metals between a JDAM and a wind turbine. And so, for example, the little control actuation system uses a little motor that uses rare earths, and then a wind turbine uses a generator and engine that uses many of the same elements. So those are highlighted here on the diagram. And this is, and so in here is where in the battery and electric modules where you would have a lithium thermal battery. Oops, sorry. And then this is the electromechanical drive and control actuator system, is where those little motors that I've been talking about would be. And then it's just worth noting that the MK-84 bomb and many similar munitions, the explosives in there range from 20 to 30% aluminum powder. So this is a huge consumption of aluminum that tends to get overlooked, because even when we're talking about military uses, it's not like the skin of an aircraft or something where it's how you would usually think of aluminum being used. Rather, it's as just explosives. And so one MK-84 uses that amount of aluminum within the explosive turns to 195 pounds, but then it's also used kind of more traditionally in the fin. And these are calculations that Romain did comparing one large wind turbine and its aluminum use, and also some of the cabling that it would need with the amount of JDAMs and MKD, or just the JDAMs that have been produced, because the amount of MK84s, since they've been around so long, is very difficult to calculate. And so the energy equivalence between the two, so the amount of aluminum that it takes to make the amount of JDAMs that have been produced is the equivalent to 8,127 wind turbines, which is the equivalent of the amount of energy that 38 nuclear reactors would produce. And it's just worth noting that, you know, as we talk about conflict minerals and the issues of the sourcing of these minerals for renewable energy and other kind of energy transition technologies, a lot of the focus is on extraction, as it should be. But when these are used for munitions, obviously, first of all, you're destroying those metals. You can't recycle them or anything. And you're using them to kill people. And it doesn't just end in people are immediately being killed and you've wasted metals that could be used for something else. This is long-term damage that's occurring. So these cause long-term health effects in the environment and people who are injured. And they are being used to destroy agricultural land, which is something we often talk about for extraction sites when, you know, the pollution from mines or processing centers makes the environment nearby kind of, uninhabitable in some cases, or unusable for things like agriculture. And similarly, like they're being used to destroy cropland and things like orchards, which are not something you can just immediately grow back, and causing long-term environmental damage from the metals that remain in the environment. And in Gaza specifically, they're being used to target solar energy infrastructure. So because the grid there is so unreliable, 20% of Gaza households use solar energy. And similar to what we're talking about dual use in the China-US metals tensions, Israel sees solar infrastructure as dual use and has used that as a reason to target it. And that's where we're ending. So we're happy to answer questions. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, both of you, Julie and Coryn. As you point out, this is not the easiest subject to talk about, since so much of it is redacted, the information coming from military sources, and even industry is not entirely sure about, or it has a studied ignorance of some of the sources of its products and its minerals. I'd like to encourage folks to put any questions they have in the Q&A. I'm going to take the privilege of facilitatorship and ask you a couple of questions right off the bat. The first is about Pentagon research. We know that obviously a good amount of money that the Pentagon spends goes into research for new products, new weapon systems, but it also includes some technological advances, especially through the DARPA project. And I'm curious whether you've found that the Pentagon or militaries elsewhere have been putting money into substitutes for these critical minerals, especially minerals that it turns out the United States is dependent upon. For instance, China, in order to get them. Obviously, we could find different sources for them, but perhaps the Pentagon is interested in finding a substitute, for instance, for lithium batteries or for these sophisticated magnets. So that's one question. And the second is, Coryn, you talked about the Defense Production Act and its expansion under Biden. And I'm curious, looking ahead, um, how much Republican support was there? I mean, these are obviously executive orders, and they use the exemptions in order to, so they wouldn't have to actually bring it to political debate. But I'm curious in your research whether you've determined whether the Republicans are perfectly happy to continue that kind of those kinds of authorizations, and whether we might expect something similar taking place in 2025 and afterwards.
For your first question, I know that there has been military research and government funding for research into alternatives, and that's something they definitely would love to not be dependent on external sources for those metals. I haven't been following it as closely because it's really hard as a non-scientist to sort of know what is like a potential technology that would be adopted versus something that would work, but it would take 20 years, or something where it's someone's sort of interesting idea and they want some, money to keep pursuing it, but it doesn't have much potential. So until those industries are really kind of off the ground, it's hard for me to kind of know which to pay attention to. But definitely it's something that the U.S. government and military, and I'm sure plenty of other industries would love. And then for the Defense Production Act, I also haven't looked at it too much about how the parties have reacted to that. I think because so much of it is military oriented and encourages extraction and processing and of course jobs in the US and Canada, but especially the US, it has pretty bipartisan support. From a Congressional Research Service report that I read, it seems like most of the opposition has been from some Democratic senators worried about the environmental impact of sort of pushing for more mines to open, especially because there's a clause that the Biden administration doesn't seem to have used yet, but could under Title I that would exempt some of these projects in ways that are a little unclear from certain regulations and liability. So sort of fast tracking extraction. And obviously there's some politicians who are opposed to that. And I assume, anything where the executive branch could have more power and do more extraction, I assume the incoming administration would be in support of it. But obviously, I think it would be in a different way, though the kind of precedent for using it at this pace and the existing precedent for encompassing a lot of things under national security and defense, like kind of energy generally, which does not exist in some other countries, similar policies. I think it'll be different, but it's a kind of a possibly scary precedent, I guess, how much expansion of this there could be.
Excellent. Thank you. Julie, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, just to say that one of the things that has been striking is the continuities among administrations when it comes to different selective measures, exemplified by Coryn's example of the Defense Production Act. In order to, as part of this like longer term effort to nearshore, reshore supply chains. And the dual use has always been more or less explicit in these efforts, right? It's just I expect that I expect that we'll see more continuities than discontinuities with respect to the Defense Production Act. I'll stop there.
Excellent. Thank you. Let's go to the questions and the Q&A. Let's start with Nick Buxton's question about China. I mean, you were very clear about some of the dependencies the United States has in its supply chain to China or through third parties, but traced back to China. So the question is, can the United States break its dependency on China? And can you give us an evaluation so far on these efforts to onshore, reshore, or homeshore, the preferred term? What's been the experience so far in terms of what the United States has tried to do?
Yeah, I'm happy to take that one. So, a whole suite of efforts over the past several years. In addition to all the different shoring, there's also friend shoring, right? So supporting opening mines in many different parts of the world outside of, in an attempt to kind of build a supply chain ecosystem outside of China. I think one of the important things to bear in mind here is that yes, in very real and critical ways, the U.S. is dependent on China for a host of rare earth bearing technologies. Also, though, it is an interdependence, right? And so China is and continues to be an important destination market for goods whose supply chains, of course, pass through the U.S. or other places globally. And so what I expect, even though it's difficult and problematic to make predictions, especially when we're looking at a highly unpredictable administration assuming office soon, is that we'll see some high profile changes, right? So where intensified investments in mines, in refining capacity, in magnet production, or what have you. But China's economy is thoroughly embedded within the global economic ecosystem. And one of the things that we have seen as countries around the world attempt to comply with and cash in on benefits available under the Inflation Reduction Act, is there's all sorts of creative legal maneuvering and corporate restructuring that happens in order to take a company that works with both the US and China and divide it into two parts so that one part works with China and one part works with the US. I expect that will simply become more common.
Excellent. And let's skip down to Vasu's question because it's related, and that is, how has China managed to achieve a monopoly or near monopoly in some cases, in the case of rare earth elements, and how has the United States, tried to, especially the Pentagon? I mean, for instance, the Pentagon has had direct contracts, I believe, with, for instance, Australian mines to ensure supply of rare earth elements. I believe it's the largest supply outside of China. I could be wrong, but so what has China done? Is it still kind of controlling this? And I understand also China has done a great job in terms of patents for processing that ensure that, at least the latest ways of processing rare earth elements are kind of under China's intellectual property, which is an intriguing way of maintaining control over a supply chain. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. Yeah. So China's monopoly over rare earth elements was the outcome of, I would say, a 40-year process of different things that were happening in China versus the West that eventually came together to manifest in the present monopoly. But a big part of that is two very different but complementary stories. One, within China, almost from the founding of the People's Republic in 1949, developing rare earths and related industry was a central priority, right? And so building industrial capacity, sending people all over the world to be trained in extractive metallurgy, and to bring that expertise back to China was a big part of that strategy. And kind of simultaneous to that, in particularly picking up speed in the 1970s and 1980s, was, you know, the deregulation and measures in the Western world that did make it easier for companies to kind of shop around globally and find places with more lax labor and environmental regulations. And so the migration of industry from other parts of the world and its consolidation in China was part of this much larger trend, right? That played out in other sectors as well, you know, textiles, electronics assembly, et cetera. And so it's important to understand China's monopoly as a result of policy and political and economic decisions, and not exclusively a matter of where the deposits are located. Because rare earth elements are not rare, right? China has a lot in its territory. Part of that is because China's territory is large, right? But rare earths are found globally, right? And so part of the reason why industry consolidated in China was simply because that was where it was worthwhile for companies to either set up shop or to subcontract their processes. But during that time, China's government and academies really invested in developing new technological applications, but also different separations and refining techniques. And so China's expertise and monopoly, particularly in patents, technologies, and applications, is a result of those investments as well. And this has been a policy talking point that I've emphasized for many years when people have asked, well, what can the US do? What can other countries do to diversify the supply chain? And one very clear answer is investing in R&D. Right?
And not to take over the Q&A, but Julie, you might want to briefly explain the Japan incident, because I've noticed that that's coming up a lot, and then kind of developments in the trade war that's going on. And sort of this is what China could do next, when it's much more complicated than that.
Yeah, thank you for that. And so the important context there is that China's monopoly over rare earth elements really consolidated around the turn of the millennium. But it really didn't make headlines until 2010, when, as a result of a long simmering dispute between China and Japan over a set of islands, Diaoyu Islands and Kaku Islands, it depends on which language you're using to describe them. Some port workers and military officials in a port in eastern China decided to take matters into their own hands and subject shipments bound for Japan to extensive inspections, right? And so the way that this story is told is that China embargoed rare earth elements to Japan. In fact, there were headlines to that effect as well. But based on my research and interviews, this seemed to be an isolated incident confined to one particular port. And those ships could have contained any number of things. It just so happened that they contained rare earth elements. Nevertheless, the story broke in the West that China had embargoed these things to Japan in retaliation for arresting a Chinese national who had ventured too close to these islands. And that has kind of stuck in the public and political imagination as fact. I remain open to seeing evidence that shows that that is in fact what did happen, but I did not find it. And the other thing that I might note is like important context is like right around that time, or just before this happened, the movie Avatar had come out. And at the time it was, I think, the highest grossing film of all time, right? And so the public imagination was kind of primed for a kind of imaginary crisis around these. And there was a lot of that kind of plot line that was used to explain China's monopoly over rare earth elements and to extrapolate what the potential implications for the rest of the world might be.
Very interesting. Thank you. Thank you for noting that, because as Corinne said, this is a reference point that comes up so often when talking about current U.S.-China disputes over minerals. Let's jump to Sophia's question, and that is, um, the incoming Trump administration obviously has probably going to increase even military spending, as the first Trump administration did. Um, and it hasn't had nice things to say about the climate. I mean, obviously, Trump himself is something of a climate denier and has said he hates wind power, and hasn't said nice things about solar either. So the question is, are we just going to see basically the focus on military applications for these minerals, or will there be any continuation of this kind of green industrial transition that, obviously the Biden administration focused so much legislation and energy on? Will there be any of that going on? And I'll amend the question as well. So that's the federal level. Are we going to see any of it continue at the state level moving forward as well?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And hi, Sophia. So I mean, we're in a space of wild speculation, really. Part of the reason for the speculation and uncertainty is that, I mean, Musk is a crony of Trump and is clearly benefiting from EVs at least, which are embedded, of course, in the set of renewable energy technologies, and those then embedded within ideas around a green industrial transition. The thing that I feel comfortable saying is that I think all the pieces are aligned to emphasize military use, but because the military itself is so focused on transitioning to renewable energy, but also using a kind of all of the above approach to its energy security, that we might see some collateral benefit for the green industrial transition, right? I mean, I think the thing to keep in mind is that just as we've emphasized in this presentation that that battery and magnet supply chains are dual use, that it does go two ways, right? So I think maybe a hopeful thing to say would be that investments in building supply chain capacity for war could be repurposed for peace and the energy transition once we make it through.
Excellent. Alexander had a question about lithium mining and how it affects the environment, especially its heavy use on water. Perhaps we can expand that to ask also the impact of rare earth mining on the environment. What kind of specific impacts do they have?
Thank you. Coryn, do you want to address this one?
Mark can go ahead. I know that more of the specifics offhand.
Yeah. Well,
having
so
been there.
yeah. So lithium mining, of course, is environmentally problematic, particularly when it comes to extracting lithium from brines. Right? It has a very heavy water footprint. There is a growing emphasis on DLE, direct lithium extraction, that claims to be less water intensive, but of course has other problems or issues associated with that. And so lithium hard rock mining shares some overlaps in the environmental impacts with rare earth hard rock mining, particularly with respect to water contamination, but also soil and air contamination. And the interesting thing there is that a lot of the hazards emerge not from exposure to the elements themselves that are sought after, whether it's lithium or it's rare earth elements, but from exposure to other materials that are dug up and pulverized and proliferate in the environment. So in my own research in Bayan-Obo in China, a lot of the public health issues were related to exposure not to rare earth elements. There were, of course, occupational health issues that resulted from that, but exposure to arsenic and fluoride and other heavy metals that proliferated in the environment as a result of extraction. A really important thing to note with respect to that kind of environmental contamination is that best available techniques do exist to significantly limit the proliferation of those kinds of particulate in the environment. However, with respect to the water impacts of lithium, this is an outstanding problem for which I have yet to see a credible solution other than reducing production.
Thank you. Any last questions, please put them in the Q&A. There is a conversation in the chat about, well, if we reduce military spending, of course, we would have more money available for an energy transition. And you had some very useful comparisons in your PowerPoint. For instance, the comparison between, for instance, a bus, a school bus, and a tank, and the sheer mineral input required for the two of them, but also your comparison between munitions and a windmill. And I'm curious whether we have any examples, perhaps not here in the United States, perhaps in other countries, where there has been kind of a direct link between reductions in military spending and money that then is available for civil production, energy transition. I just saw the other day that the Biden administration had expected to have all of these electrified postal vehicles. They were not delivered on time. Why? Well, perhaps because they had given the contract to a military supplier, and someone at the military supplier says, "We don't know how to make postal trucks." So that was not a particularly good example of conversion, but perhaps you have some others you can share with us.
Oh, that's an interesting question. Corinne.
Yeah, I haven't looked enough at other countries to know if there are current programs, but I know it's been for decades there's been kind of a push to reduce military budgets, and then that would come with that, and the political opposition by kind of transitioning them to working on renewable energy or kind of more civilian uses. And I'm forgetting the name. I think it might have been the Plowshares movement in Great Britain, if I remember right, in the 70s or 80s. I'm kind of fuzzy at the moment offhand on the exact details, but they're actually workers who their proposals to kind of end their factories, and they came up with alternative things that they could manufacture at the same kind of manufacturing lines, the same metals, etc. And even some of these technologies, for them designing new technologies that didn't totally exist yet, but had a lot of potential because they had so much expertise behind them. And unfortunately, that did not come to fruition, but there have been some transitions that have happened when necessary. I think kind of going back to the complexity of what could happen next, the US transition, so much of it has focused on EVs, and not just for the military, but for civilian use, like almost like the keystone of it has been transitioning cars to a different kind of car, rather than to other modes of transportation. And so I think, for example, Thacker Pass, I think the GM, it's in the around like a $700 million, I think, is their stake in it now, as the majority owners of it. And it's sort of seen as lithium mine that's needed for general renewables, but besides the military interest, so much of it now is for GM, which is primarily an automaker with a large military kind of subunit there. And so we know that the incoming administration is hostile to renewables, but then as Julie mentioned, close with Elon Musk, so maybe kind of more friendly to EVs, which are not exactly what we need for an energy transition. And then there's been sort of mixed things from the auto industry about whether they've dumped a lot of money into making EVs, but it doesn't seem like what they would prefer to be doing. And so it's, are some of their renewable purposes inextricable from the things that the Trump administration would want to do? Maybe are some of the things that they would try to cut also inextricable from things like EVs? It's also possible, sort of like how the military now has investments in Canada, and the Trump administration is openly hostile to China, but they need to get these metals from somewhere to increase their military production. So it has to come from somewhere, essentially, and they're going to probably have to make some compromises in their positions, but we don't know from where.
Excellent. Thank you. Julie, did you want to add anything to that, or?
No, that's all right.
Okay. There are two more questions in the Q&A. Let's take those, and then maybe we can wrap up after that. From Travis, the question really is about nuclear power. Is there a push in the United States, and do you anticipate a greater push under the Trump administration to develop, redevelop, re-energize, if you will, the nuclear power and industry here as an alternative to renewables? And of course, there are questions around the uranium supply chain as well. And then from Nick, the question about the United States coordinating with NATO on critical minerals, sourcing of critical minerals, and whether that will have an impact moving forward. Of course, if Trump takes the United States out of NATO, then that coordination might disappear altogether. But assuming that the United States remains in NATO, what kind of coordination has been taking place and might we expect in the future?
Thank you. Yeah, so with respect to Travis's question about nuclear power, I mean, there's a lot of diverse interests that are really pushing hard for greater nuclear power development, right? I'm sure, as you're aware, it's an intense debate within the energy transition concerned crowd itself, but also, with respect to AI proponents and folks who are concerned with powering massive data centers, right? There's serious and pretty radical proposals on the table to significantly expand nuclear power generation. We're concerned with this from a materials standpoint primarily, right? And so the important thing to keep in mind is that although we talked about rare earth elements specifically for their renewable, which is to say wind and solar, whether or not you include nuclear under that, of course, is a matter of intense opinion and disagreement. But we've been looking primarily at wind and solar in the use of rare earth elements. However, rare earth elements are used for every major form of energy generation, right? Whether that is fossil fuels or also especially in nuclear energy generation. And so I raise that point just to say that from a materials standpoint, expanding nuclear power capacity doesn't get us away from these existing supply chain concerns about where the raw materials come from. And so, yeah, that's one conclusion that you can certainly make based on the research that we presented here. And then with respect to Nick's question, one of the interesting things is, so we haven't looked specifically at this, but we have been interested in and concerned with the sort of broader minerals diplomacy policy of the US more generally. And one of the things that we expect, and this is reflected by interlocutors of ours within the State Department, is that all the efforts to build a critical materials alliance and partnerships overseas in order to diversify the supply chain ecosystem, or essentially build a supply chain ecosystem outside of China. Our sense is that those will continue, right? Whether or not NATO is part of the picture. There's a lot of different mechanisms that are already active, right? Through the Department of State, there's different financing mechanisms that are already active. And then of course, there's the creative policy work that makes foreign territories effectively domestic to the US. So we expect to see that continue.
Yeah. And just to go back to nuclear, one thing I haven't focused on, so didn't include here, but the Biden administration has been pushing to expand and upgrade the nuclear arsenal. Um, and that's been a major piece of the proposed DoD budget for 2025. And these metals are also used, besides uranium, obviously, in nuclear weapons. For example, the heavy materials that China talks about, that China is restricted, is most of that is tungsten, which is used in munitions as for penetrators, but also for a lot of other more normal alloy uses, and it's used for radiation shielding in nuclear technologies. And so there's competing uses there as well, that in either kind of development would occur.
Excellent, thank you. I want to give you guys a chance to say any last thoughts before we sign off. Any conclusions, any questions for us moving forward? Give you that opportunity. Coryn, do you want to start?
I think I've said most of my thoughts throughout this time, but if anyone has, I'll go back to our first slide, because if anyone has input or questions or thoughts, we really welcome that, of kind of specific questions that we should have answered, or kind of lines of inquiry. Some of our work with nonprofits and groups across the world so far has given us really useful insights. So we really appreciate that.
Thank you so much. And to add to that, I just wanted to say, so John, I put a link to our 3-page summary of the case study comparing JDAMs and wind turbines, but I think it only went to the host and the panelists. I don't think I have the power to put it in the chat to everyone else. But just to underscore Coryn's point, I mean, this is what we're sharing with you is very much and part of an ongoing project. And the other thing I want to say too is that we've chosen a particular angle on this based on how we could navigate a data poor landscape. But I think the questions around conflict, around competing uses, and around increasing command of these supply chains by weapons interests is big enough that any angle any one of you can find into this problem will be helpful and illuminating. So particularly if you want to talk more about doing this research and joining forces, please do get in touch with us. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you both, Julie and Coryn. This has been an illuminating presentation, illuminating the dark corners of of this topic, especially as you say in a data poor environment. We'll post this video and send the link around to folks, as well as give you an opportunity to join our network and find out about future events. We'll be having Sovia join us in January to talk about U.S.-China competition specifically. And I look forward to continuing this conversation with everyone. And thank you again for joining today.